John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the creation of man in our continuing study of the book of Genesis. When we left off, we were looking at the entire chapter, and we noted that we can actually see this chapter in two sections. First of all, day 1, day 2, and day 3 talk about created kingdoms, so that on day 1 we had light and darkness. Corresponding to that, over on day 4, we're going to have the light bearers, the things that rule over the day and the night. And that's why I call this created kings as opposed to the created kingdoms. On day 2, we have the division of the waters into sky and sea. On day 5, corresponding to that, we have birds in the sky and fish in the sea. And even though the passage doesn't say it, I can perhaps interject that birds rule over the sky and fish rule in the sea. On day 3, we have the forming of dry land and vegetation. And on day 6, the things that go on the land animals, with man as the ruler, and that will be mentioned. And then finally, on day 7, we see the Creator King, the Lord, taking his rest. Come to a climax in day 6 when God says, "Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over the cattle, and over all the earth, and over every creeping thing that creeps on the earth." Notice the plurality there. Let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. And of course, the question comes up about this plurality. Is this a plurality which some Hebrew scholars point to, known as a plural of majesty? It very well could be. When you want to describe something very big and majestic, you describe it in the plural. But this is very rare to do so with the personal pronoun. The other possibility, of course, among Christians, we look at that and we say, well, could it be that that's a picture of the Trinity? And again, that's possible from our perspective, but perhaps there's another idea that's presented, that there's a plurality, another plurality that's mentioned right here in the passage, and that's in verse 27, when God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him, and here it is, male and female he created them. That in man there's a plurality, just as God is describing a plurality within himself. Now that brings up the next question, and that is the question of what does it mean that man is in the image of God? I don't think it's just that man is male and female, and that there's a similar plurality seen in the person of God, but rather in the passage, notice, let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and here it is, and let them rule over the fish of the sea. That rulership idea is mentioned right here in verse 26. The rulership idea is mentioned again when we get to verse 28, where God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth and subdue it," and here it is, "and rule over the fish of the sea and over the birds of the sky and over every living thing that moves on the earth." So that idea of rulership is part and parcel with being made in the image of God, where God is ruling over all creation, and now man is made to be deputized by God, to act in the place of God, to rule as a stewardship under God as he rules over the earth. So what I see here is that man has a federal headship. That is, God is God over all creation, and yet he has deputized man and made him the federal head over all of creation, where he is to rule over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the sky, over every living thing that moves on the earth. This also gives us a basis for stewardship and a basis for ecology. Man has been given the earth not just as his own possession, but as God's possession, and yet he is to be the caretaker of that creation in place of God. Verses 29 and 30 tell us that God said, "Behold, I have given you every plant yielding seed that is on the surface of all the earth, and every tree which has fruit yielding seed, it shall be food for you, and to every beast of the sky, and to every bird of the sky, and to every, or beast of the earth, I should say, and to every bird of the sky, and to everything that moves on the earth, which has life, I have given every green plant for food. And it was so. And so you have the culmination of all creation, that it's been supplied, there's dry land, there's food to eat, and everything is good. Now, Genesis chapter 1, as we go through that, we ought to note that the Israelites were going through something similar in their situation. So that in Genesis chapter 1, we had light and darkness, which are made by God on day 1. And the Israelites had seen God bring light, and remember, they'd seen him bring darkness over the land of Egypt in one of those plagues where there had been darkness over the entire land. In Genesis 1, we have a division of the waters on day 2, and the Israelites had passed through the waters of the Red Sea. They had seen the dividing hand of God at work. In Genesis chapter 1, we see the sun and the moon and the stars are created, and that's stated on day 4. The Israelites had seen, they had come out of Egypt where the Egyptians worshipped the sun and the moon and the stars, and they had seen the sun darkened, and probably the moon and the stars as well, darkened in Egypt during the time of the plagues. In Genesis chapter 1, man is created in the image of God, and that was especially significant to the Israelites who came out of Egypt, where in Egypt only the Pharaoh was thought to be made in the image of God. So that man is told to rule over the earth here in Genesis chapter 1, and only the Pharaoh had the right of rulership. So that mankind is given a high position, an exalted position over all creation. Man is placed into a beautiful garden. We're going to see that in Genesis chapter 2. And the Israelites are going to be tempted to return to the meats of Egypt, but Canaan is the new promised Eden. Instead of wanting to go back to the garden that was Egypt, they're going to go to the garden in the future, the garden of Canaan, the place of milk and honey. In light of Israel's personal relationship with God, they need to know that he is not only the God of Israel, but he's the God of all of creation, that God is not just a little tribal God, but he's the God of all men. And this is set forth right here in Genesis chapter 1. Now, some lessons from Genesis chapter 1. First of all, there's only one God, and that is the God who created us. He is our creator, not all of those other gods of Mesopotamia and Egypt and other places. The Bible is intensely monotheistic. Secondly, the God who created us is a very big God. He's bigger than all other forces. He's bigger than Pharaoh. He's bigger than other nations. He's bigger than all those gods that are falsely worshipped. God is personally involved in his creation. Creation was not a matter of an accidental happening where some gods were fighting each other and oops, they just happened to create. Mankind is not an afterthought. Rather, he's the culmination of God's work in creation. And the purpose of the Genesis account is not merely to have us view the creation, but that we might see the Creator who created the creation, the special care that he takes in creating us. We're reminded finally that in the New Testament, where Paul says in Colossians chapter 3, verses 9 through 11, do not lie to one another, since you've laid aside the old self with its evil practices and have put on the new self, who is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created him. We have an image. We are being remade into the image of the one who created us. A renewal in which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and freeman, but Christ is all and in all. The image which fell in the garden is going to one day be restored, and we're in process of being restored to that image.